You're listening to the Paul Young Podcast.
I was doing a book signing, and from the very beginning, since I had no clue about what being an author is supposed to be like, since I'd never been one, and the first time that I was asked to do a book signing, I immediately knew that I didn't want to stand behind a table or behind a desk. I didn't like the sense of separation and distance that it communicated. I didn't like that. It sort of felt like it would be something that would give me a sense of importance, as if I was more important than the person coming, than the person bringing their book and having me sign it. Like, what an odd thing that is, isn't it? That you get to sign a book, something that has reached into the holy places of their heart, into their hurts, into their sorrows, into their griefs, into their addictions. So they walked up, a couple. They're probably in their, 40s? And she was already crying. His eyes were moist, but she was already crying. And I had a table behind me. And if you know me, I like to hug because I think it's a sacrament, especially in a world where touch has been so dangerous. To be a safe place, to touch, to hug. And yeah, I'm sensitive. There are some people that are still so triggered by touch that it's a hard space. But I can tell you that I am so incredibly honored that there are some who have hugged me, and I've been the first person in decades that they felt was safe enough. She hugged me and just started bawling. He, on the other hand, walked over to the table behind me and started laying down photographs. And when she had recovered enough and he was done, he said, "I have a story to tell you." I love stories. Everybody's a story. You can drop a pin anywhere on the planet and find the person that is there, and you will hear a story. I tell people I think that's why eternity will take so long. Our stories are so interwoven, the breadth and the width of them, the depth of them. So he tells me how about 3 years before this meeting that we were having, he and his wife suffered an incredibly great sadness. Their early 20s daughter had entered a roadway late at night, and somebody under the influence of alcohol, drunk, had entered it. It was a one-way, and they were going the wrong way up a one-way, and hit her head on and killed her instantly. Early 20s, 21, I think. And they were absolutely devastated, only child. Their whole life revolved around this girl. This was way before they'd heard anything about the shack. So they struggled for the next couple years. And every time that it looked like she might be able to pull herself out of the abyss, something triggered her back. Some memory, somebody's comments, some picture. And she'd crash again, down into the deep places. And she just couldn't get out. And in somewhat of a desperation, one day her husband said to her, "Perhaps we just need to have a change of scenery. There are 2 states next to us that we have never been in. So why don't we take a few weeks and we'll just go travel. We won't even set up a plan. We'll just go. And we'll go exploring these other states. Just drive." And he's thinking that maybe, and he tells me this later, that maybe by a change of scene, it would allow her enough time to resurrect. And so they do that. They get the time off that they need, and they just go traveling through these 2 states, mostly farm states, big, huge open fields. You drive and you see the fields. They seem to go on forever. There are fence lines here and there. And they would stop at different towns, and they would find a bed and breakfast, or they would find a little quaint inn or something, and then they would stay there. And then when they were ready, they would go find another place. Well, they arrived at this one town, and they have pictures, all of this is pictures, photographs. And they get to the one town, and they decide to stay at this little inn. And while they're there, they decide that they'd like to have a picnic lunch the next day. So they got everything that they needed, including, the little plastic tablecloth. In the morning, they made themselves sandwiches, took their pop or cider or whatever it was. I don't remember what was in the picture. It was a small town, but every town's got a city park somewhere. And they just decided to go looking and see where it was. So they started doing these concentric circles, just driving in these concentric circles looking for a town park. Then they could find a picnic table and set up their picnic lunch and enjoy themselves. That's what they wanted to do that day. But the problem was they couldn't find a park, which is odd. And so they kept making these enlarged circles, right? They started in the middle of town and then looked for a park. Every town's got a park except this one. And so eventually they were out of town, still going in circles basically down these long now country roads. Now, remember, this is not a place they had ever been. And right about noon, they decided that they were done. Well, he told me he decided that they were done and should probably just go back to the inn and, they'd have their picnic lunch in their room. But she had other ideas. And she points to this road and says, it's a paved road, heading further out of town. She said, you know what, let's just go down this road. We'll go try this road. And so they went down that road 6 or 7 miles. And he's getting a little fidgety, he says. But she says, well, let's try that road. And it's a dirt road. It just goes off from the paved road that they were on. And he's like, oh, okay. So they go down this dirt road for a couple miles. They're driving along, not too fast. And all there is fields. There's not even buildings. There's no houses down that road. There's just fields. And a long distance away from the road, there are fence lines. When all of a sudden she says, look, there's a picnic table. And sure enough, they have a picture of it. And you look at the picture and it looks just like a picnic table. Right out in the middle of this huge mowed field. Mowed in the sense of, there used to be a crop there that's been cut down. And they're happy. Like, finally they found a picnic table. It's not really a park, but there's nobody around, so who's going to complain? So they take their picnic lunch and walk out to the table. But it turns out not to be a table. It's actually, from the other side, there are steps going up to a stoop. It was concrete. There used to be probably some kind of a house there, and it had burnt down or something because there was no trace of it except for the little steps that go up to the flat concrete top where you probably entered the house. But nobody's around, so they decide, well, it's as close to a picnic table as we've seen all day, so they decided to go ahead and have their picnic there. They laid out the tablecloth. There are photos of it. And they took out their sandwiches and their pop or cider, whatever it was. And they were having a picnic. Now, one of the odd things about this particular piece of property is there was a fence line along, it was about 100 yards away, maybe a little more. But there was a little outbuilding. And maybe it was just a tool shed or something. But she starts looking at it and she squints and says, there looks like a sign above that door of that little outbuilding. Can you see what it says? And it's an oval-shaped sign. White sign with something written on it. And he's looking and he goes, nah, I don't know what it says, but I'll walk over there and see, because, what else do they have to do? There's not swings or anything. So he walks over there and he comes back and he shrugs his shoulders and he says, it just says the shack. That's all it says, the shack. Now remember, they never heard of the book. They're just out there and this thing says the shack. So that was the end of it. They didn't pay any attention. Picnic lunch is done. They make sure they don't leave any garbage. They pick up all their stuff, fold up their little plastic picnic tablecloth, and they start walking back toward their car. And suddenly she stops and she says, I'm going to go in there. And he's confused. Like, you're going to go in where? She says, I'm going to go in the shack. I'm going to go over there and go in it. And he's like, probably not a good idea. What if somebody's sleeping in there? It's not very big. You're going to scare them, or I'm not sure that's a good idea. She says, well, you can go to the car. I'm going to go into the shack. You can come if you want. So she just turns and starts heading for that little outbuilding. And she gets there, sure enough, oval sign. They have pictures. It says the shack. She walks right in. And he points to all these photos on the table. and they're of every part of the inside of that little shack, 10 by 10 or something like that, very small. And on one wall, I mean, there's no windows, but there is light that comes in underneath the roof line. But on this one wall, there is a desk. And on the desk, there looks like a sign-up sheet. And next to it, there is a little note that's printed. And it simply says, "Please take whatever you need." And next to it, there are 2 copies of a book they'd never heard of, called The Shack. He says, we sign our names and we look, and there are people's names from all over the country. And he said, so we take this book, and now he's weeping. And he says, it changed our lives. Somebody got a nudge, that nudge of the Holy Spirit, to put in this little tiny outbuilding copies of The Shack. And people had driven from all over the country, like they had, to find this little outbuilding so that they could get a copy of the book that would speak into their deep sadness. She hugs me again. She said, only God, only the kindness of love would put a book out there, and we who didn't know would travel all this distance from home to find it. It healed me, she says. And we all cry. Thank you for listening. If you would like to contact or connect with us with inquiries and questions, comments, suggestions, stories, and more, please visit paulyoungpodcast.com. There you will find resources and notes related to any particular episode. Today, participate with love, do the next right thing, and trust the ripples.